Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Welcome back to the Watches and Style channel. Um, I've just managed to gain access to the interview that the Neue Zürcher Zeitung has conducted with Sacha Davidoff, one half of the famous Davidoff brothers, one of the foremost specialists in vintage Speedmasters. So there is a June 1st dated interview that Andrea Martel conducted with Sacha Davidoff that sheds light to a very interesting perspective and a very balanced and nuanced perspective on the issue. This was, remember, just to quickly remind you of the timeline, on Thursday, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung published an article that presented serious allegations about the provenance of the record-breaking vintage Speedmaster that was sold in November 2021 by Philips of Geneva for more than 3 million Swiss francs. And that article also contained a lot of developments from Omega's part, including a statement by their CEO, Reinhard Eschlimann, which pointed the fingers at three internal actors, three now former Omega employees who collaborated with, seemingly with global ring of alleged conspirators. Hey guys, how are you doing? Nice to see you both. Thank you. Who collaborated with a number of global alleged conspirators in forging, at least in part, this vintage Speedmaster and doctoring a specific kind of provenance for it, a very specific genealogy for it that presented it as something that it was not, as an early example of a first series example of a vintage Speedmaster, which had a very attractive patina, gorgeously sun-baked dial. And on this was, of course, in part, the report that NZZ presented, the report that the Neue Zürcher Zeitung laid out, was in large part based on an earlier expose by Jose Perez, Periscope, who in a blog post from April 2023 had already shared with the general public very serious allegations about the authenticity of this Speedmaster, who raised some very serious questions about the authenticity of this Speedmaster with significant photographic evidence. On June 2nd, we discovered again with another article that Neue Zürcher Zeitung published that the buyer ultimately was in fact Omega, and that they have every intention of bringing everyone who was involved in the process of falsifying this watch, thereby enriching themselves and in the same process also damaging Omega's reputation, to justice. And in this process so far, both Omega and Philips claim victimhood, present themselves as the victims of an alleged global conspiracy that basically ended up presenting this rather beautiful watch that consists of original parts that were harvested from vintage Speedmasters of different eras, parts that were reproduced, allegedly forged by third parties, a genealogy that was doctored and presented in a falsified manner, allegedly with the help of a few internal actors, a few now former Omega employees, and finally also a concerted effort to encourage and in fact push Omega to buy the watch by any means necessary, which ultimately, it is argued, ended up producing this rather artificial price. Now, I'm going to share with you the interview that Neue Zürcher Zeitung conducted on June 1st, so before Omega stepped forward, identifying themselves as the buyer. And it is an interview with the expert Sacha Davidoff, one half of Davidoff brothers. He is with his older brother, Roy Davidoff, one of the foremost experts on vintage Speedmasters and certainly one of the world-renowned dealers in vintage Speedmasters. So let's read on the caption. The title says, "The Speedmaster expert says such absurdly record-breaking prices influence the larger market. Absolutely not." Sacha Davidoff, specialist of vintage watches, has followed the auction process for the 3 million franc worth Omega Speedmaster. However, he has himself not placed a bid. And the caption for this lovely photograph of the genuinely beautiful piece, no matter how allegedly falsified, says, for the Davidoff brothers, the core of their business are vintage Speedmaster wristwatches. And in this picture, you see the 3 million franc worth, or the watch that was sold by Philips for 3 million francs. Andrea Martel's first question goes something like this. Mr. Davidoff, you and your brother Roy belong to some of the most well-known dealers of vintage Omega Speedmaster watches. Have you actually followed the November 2021 auction for the 3 million Swiss franc Speedmaster? Sacha Davidoff responds, in a way, setting the stage for the interview in a somewhat comical or tragicomical way. He says, "I was outside of the hotel in Geneva where the auction was taking place, and I was eating something. Suddenly, someone told me that the bidding has reached 1 million francs, and that's when I stepped in." So it's very, very funny that Sacha Davidoff was actually not that invested on this particular lot, and he was stuffing his face, and he just had to, dust himself off, finish his meal very quickly and run back to the hotel to see what's going on because someone told him that they have actually surpassed 1 million francs. The second question, how do you account for this enormous price point when the pre-auction estimate was so much lower, so much less? Sacha Davidoff responds, according to what I've heard, this auction process involved two very rich and overly ambitious collectors, one of whom was from China and the other from the Middle East, who stumbled upon or who engaged in a bidding war. And this was a war of egos with money being no object. This was a war of egos without a limit on the price. Martel for NZZ asks, how would you value the watch yourself? And Sacha Davidoff responds, many people have asked me, and I told them that the watch was probably worth somewhere in the region between 250,000 to 350,000 francs, which is still higher than the estimate, of course. I have, however, told them that I was myself not going to bid for the watch. This is Sacha Davidoff's response. Many people have asked me about my valuation, my evaluation of the watch, and I told them that probably it was somewhere in the region between 250,000 to 350,000 in Swiss francs. But I've also told them that I was not going to bid on the watch myself. And he continues, when my brother and I inspected the watch, we have noted that the dial, the watch face, was reloomed, which means that the original luminous material on the indices and the hands were renewed, right? So they have, at first blush, identified the watch as reloomed, which, you know, again, I'm just presenting my opinion, but that's already a no-go for any serious collector to begin with. When you notice that a vintage watch, no matter how beautiful, has a dial that was reloomed or rematched in terms of loom, so it looks a particular way, aesthetically speaking, it loses its collectible value. That doesn't mean it's not a pretty watch. That doesn't mean it's not a beautiful watch. But that's not the kind of condition you would expect from a vintage watch that would break an absolute record for one of the most iconic models that Swiss horology ever produced. So that's already a big question mark. That's already a huge red flag. Hey, Jake Brooks, nice to see you, man. Sacha Davidoff continues, there were also a number of clear scratches on the dial. And after a closer inspection, we have concluded that the bezel and the rest of the watch did not belong together. They were not together originally because the aging of the bezel and the rest of the watch was incoherent, was incongruent, right? It somehow did not fit together. You know, again, I want to remind you, Sacha Davidoff is making these comments before he probably knew, and certainly before Omega came forward identifying themselves as the buyer. His scenario was that there were two overly ambitious collectors with huge egos, one from China, one from the Middle East, ostensibly, and that they ended up engaging each other with money being no object in a bidding war. At any rate, that was the rumor Sacha Davidoff heard. At this moment, the public was not clued into the fact that Omega was the buyer. So ultimately, he says, we looked at the watch, we saw that the dial was reloomed, and also that there were many scratches on the dial that we could see. And after closer inspection, Sacha Davidoff finally adds that we came to the conclusion that the bezel and the rest of the watch were not born together, so to speak, were not originally together. They didn't belong together, since the aging process between them was incongruent, not coherent. So the interviewer interjects and says, so we're talking about a forgery. And Sacha Davidoff responds in a very nuanced way, and I really appreciate it, because this is how you can tell a real watch expert, not someone who screams at the camera. He says, I would not call this a forgery, but more so a Frankenstein watch, or a Franken Watch, as we sometimes call it, which means that it was put together from parts that were harvested from a number of different watches. And then Sacha Davidoff adds, not every single vintage watch that is not 100% original is necessarily a forgery, which again you might see as a prevarication if you look from a certain perspective, if you're expecting some sort of harsh statement, especially at a level where people are not privy to every single detail, don't even know at this point that Omega actually ended up buying the watch. Sacha Davidoff is simply saying, you know, there are a lot of vintage watches out there that are not original 100%, that were not born that way 100%. That doesn't necessarily mean they are forgeries. And Martel says, could you please clarify this? Could you please explain this more completely? And Sacha Davidoff presents his idea that there are three, for me, he says there are three kinds of vintage watches. The first one, and that is the most valuable, is the watch that consists fully of original parts. It is in a condition in which it was born, right? So that's the first kind of watch that Sacha Davidoff identifies as an expert, the first kind of vintage watch. It is in an original condition, all original parts, as it was, quote unquote, born, as it left the manufacturer. And he says, This is extremely rare, especially with a vintage watch, and that's why they are so desirable. Then, and this is the second kind of vintage watch that Sacha Davidoff identified, then there are watches that consist exclusively of original parts, authentic parts, which did not belong together at the very beginning, right? So the second kind of vintage watch, according to Sacha Davidoff, are the kind of watches that have authentic parts, that have parts manufactured by the brand which has its name on the dial, but the watch was not born necessarily like that. This is the category Frankenstein watch, if it could be proven, if it could be established that way, if you can prove these allegations. And then, and this is the third kind of watch that Sacha Davidoff identifies, there are watches for which certain parts were reproduced because the original parts were simply not available. They were simply not at hand. And these you can understand as either forgeries or reproductions, right? Again, a very nuanced view. If you were really cynical, you might come up with another conclusion, but I think Sacha Davidoff's further answers will really certify his perspective as being extremely nuanced, even as he aspires himself to practices that are much more ethical and much more clear-cut than what he describes here. So the three kinds of vintage watch: one is all original parts as it was born, in the same condition that the watch left the manufacturer. The second part is a watch that consists of authentic parts, of parts that were made by the brand, but that did not originally belong together. The watch was not born that way. And then there is the third category that he says is a Frankenstein watch, for which certain parts had to be reproduced because the original parts were simply not there or not available. And that, he says, is either a forgery or a reconstruction. And the interviewer asks, out of these, which ones are actually legitimate? And outright, Sacha Davidoff says watches with reproduced parts, replica parts, are simply no-go. They're not allowed. In either case, I have nothing against watches that were restored with original parts or even later service parts if the seller clearly declares the kind of work that was done to the watch. In earlier periods, we had undertaken such projects, but since so many years, we have stopped doing that because it takes too much time, too much money, and at the end of the day, the market looks at these watches in a derogatory way. Nowadays, we simply buy and sell only watches that can be certified as 100% authentic. Right? Again, I think very clear answer. Sacha Davidoff says watches with restored, watches with reproduced or replica parts are simply a no-go. He also says that he has nothing against watches that were restored with original parts or even with later service parts, especially when earlier parts are just not available, if the seller clearly declares them. However, he has stopped, in any case, selling or buying watches like that because it is just a waste of time and money. And ultimately, the market looks down upon such watches, and it is simply not worth it. Nowadays, they prefer to buy and sell watches that can be certified as 100% authentic. And here's a more difficult question. And again, I think the difference, the response that Sacha Davidoff gives is very, very important. The interviewer asks, is it difficult to conclude if a vintage watch is authentic or a patchwork, patched together, assembled together, authentic or Franken Watch? Sacha Davidoff's response: the older the watch is, the more difficult this becomes. The authentication of a Speedmaster from the 1950s can only be done, can only be accomplished probably by about 4 or 5 people worldwide. And definitely the auction houses don't belong to this group. So he's saying that if you need to authenticate a Speedmaster from the 1950s, which is what this record-breaking watch purportedly was, you would need to consult a group of 4 to 5 people. You know, there are at most 5 people worldwide who could undertake this process, who could actually certify a watch like that. And none of these people, Sacha Davidoff says, actually work with auction houses. Therefore, he says it would be a good investment to pay for the certificate of authenticity by the brand. And of course, the caveat here, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, but the Davidoff brothers have collaborated over the years quite closely with Omega themselves. And it makes, of course, absolute sense that they would trust, that Sacha Davidoff here specifically would trust the authentication process of the brand itself, which, of course, at this point, because of this ongoing process of investigation and because of this whole public debacle around the Speedmaster that never was, is a service that is currently unavailable. Omega does not provide certificates of authenticities or archival extracts at this point in time and until further notice. So now another important question, right? Sacha Davidoff just said only 4 or 5 people worldwide can actually authenticate a watch like this. No one who works for an auction house at the moment is actually qualified to do this. It would be therefore a good investment to pay for the certificate of authenticity from the brand. The next question is, has this $3 million worth purchase influenced the market in any way? And Sacha Davidoff responds, such a result only confuses the market and certainly does not establish any trust, which is very interesting, right? We have already spoken that Omega itself as a brand was overly enthusiastic about this particular sale, since it sold for more than $3 million, which was 8 times more than what the record was at the time for an Omega Speedmaster. And Sacha Davidoff's assessment of the situation is actually the opposite, right? He says results like this that are out of all recognition, out of all measure for the market, actually simply confuse the market and take apart the trust, not the other way around, which again is a very important assessment that the brands, the watch manufacturers would ignore at their own peril. It says that there is, of course, still demand for authentic examples of especially the first series of the Omega Speedmaster, but the buyers want to know the complete provenance, the full provenance, and want preferably to get an untouched example that comes as humanly possible directly from the buyer themselves or from the heirs, from the family of the first owner of the watch. So that's an interesting trend, right? And again, there's much to unpack there. I don't want to belabor it too much, but that's just a very pregnant paragraph. These kinds of exorbitant prices only serve to confuse the market, Sacha Davidoff opines. It actually takes apart the trust. In either case, it doesn't establish trust, right? Schafft sicher kein Vertrauen. And he says there's, of course, always demand for authentic examples of especially first series Speedmasters, but the buyers want to know the full provenance, and preferably they would buy an untouched example that, if possible, comes directly from the first owner, from the original owner, or their heirs, their families. Next question. Has consequently, as a result of this record-breaking sale, did the general price point of a vintage Speedmaster increase? Sacha Davidoff says no. And that's a beautiful answer. Look at this. That's why I love the Davidoff brothers. It is so easy for him. His business depends on it. He can simply say yes and no. He can give a halfway answer. He could say, yeah, a little bit, so he can list the next Speedmaster with a 2,000 franc premium? He doesn't, because he's an actual watch expert who deals with watches, yes, who makes his living, his business on selling vintage Speedmasters, yes, but not at the expense of his knowledge, not at the expense of his actual expertise, not at the expense of his actual integrity. So when someone asks him, as a journalist from one of the most important, one of the major newspapers of his country, when they ask him this kind of question, even though it is so easy for him to say, yes, the values have increased, the watches are selling for 3-4 times than before, or a little bit. He could say all these things. He just says no. And he says such absurdly high record prices influence the general markets. Not at all. They don't influence the market, the general market at all, because they are so absurd, so out of all proportion, because they are understood to be outliers. What a beautiful answer. These are the kind of dealers that should exist, right? Not the speculators and so-called investors who try to manipulate every single information to their personal benefit. What a beautiful answer. Next question. If it becomes known that the Speedmaster in question is actually a forgery, how can the buyer protect themselves, right? Remember, again, this is June 1st. This interview is dated June 1st. So the general public, as well as the interviewer, and presumably Sacha Davidoff also does not know that Omega was the buyer. So take this question with a grain of salt. The journalist asks if it is common knowledge that the Speedmaster in question is actually a forgery, is an actual forgery. How can the buyer defend themselves? Hardly. They can hardly defend themselves, since the auction houses take no responsibility for the authenticity of watches that they have on offer. This is Sacha Davidoff's first answer. That is explicitly in their terms of business. At best, they might actually take the watch back if it is absolutely necessary to save their reputation. However, in this particular case, I doubt that the buyer would actually go into public, because ultimately no one really thought, no one really held that the watch was actually worth 3 million. But if he actually tried, if this buyer, who was not yet identified at the time, tried to take his money back, I don't think that it would actually work in his favor. I don't think that it would actually work, right? He can't get his money back, Sacha Davidoff says, because the seller has already been paid. The auction house does not have the money anymore. Right, so he was very clear. Of course, this was now 3 days ago, 2 days before, sorry, a day before it was announced to the public that the watch in question was actually bought by Omega. So he says, I don't think there's anything that the buyer could do, because the auction houses take no responsibility. That is explicitly in their terms of business. They might take the watch back to save their reputation. I wonder, in this case, I doubt that the buyer would go into the public anyways, because no one actually believed that this watch would be worth 3 millions. And ultimately, even if he tries to take the money back, tough luck, the money is already gone. The buyer has been paid for. The auction house doesn't have any money. Now, there is a very interesting question. I hope this can excite some people, because it is perhaps a nice fold into the story. The interviewer asks, is there actually a Speedmaster out there that would be 3 million francs worth, that would be worth 3 million francs? Is there a Speedmaster out there that would actually be worth this amount of money? This is Sacha Davidoff's response. As far as I know, there is a watch that could actually earn this price. A first series of Speedmaster at 2915-1 that remains unworn. It is somewhere in Sweden. The Omega Museum has now been trying for a couple of years to buy this particular watch. So, in fact, at least according to the rumors, at least according to the stories that have been swirling in the grapevine, through the grapevine, there is actually a first series of a vintage Speedmaster from 1957, maybe early 58, that remains unworn until now, somewhere in Sweden, that the Omega Museum already made attempts to buy a couple of years ago, but so far no luck, and the public has not been exposed to the watch yet. And the very last question: would you recommend against buying a vintage watch from an auction? So the journalist asked Sacha Davidoff if he would actually advise against buying vintage watches from auctions. And once again, he has a very nuanced answer. He doesn't say absolutely not. He doesn't say don't worry about it. He says if you would like to buy a watch from an auction, it is absolutely crucial that you inspect it in a painstaking fashion, and if necessary, consult an expert, right? If you would like to buy a vintage watch from an auction, it's crucial to inspect it in advance in as much detail as possible, and if necessary, also consult an expert. The timepieces are offered for preview, are exhibited for a few days before the auction. As a buyer, you have to keep yourself informed. You have to be aware
Ultimately, the auction houses serve the interests of the sellers and not those of the buyers. This is something Eric Wind always says in his lectures for the Horological Society of New York, in his conversations, especially with that conversation in the Collectability podcast with the Patek expert John Reardon, with whom he actually worked together at Christie's. The auction houses have a duty, have a fiduciary duty to the sellers, to the people who consign watches with them, but they don't have this sort of responsibility to the buyers. And in this case, as Sacha Davidoff underlined many times, that their own terms of business absolves them of taking full responsibility for authenticating the watches. So it's always the case, for better or worse, at this point in time, if you want to buy a watch from an auction house, that you personally take part in the previews, inspect the watches as thoroughly as you can, and ideally consult an expert opinion as well. Ideally, the opinion of an expert who can act on your behalf. You know, either you go with that expert to the preview or send an expert or a consultant to actually thoroughly inspect the watches for you. Okay. Thank you so much for being here with me. This was the third installment in the incredible story of the Speedmaster that never was. We started with the original article from Neue Zürcher Zeitung that was building on the evidence of allegations first presented by Periscope in April 2023 and really laid out a very compelling case as to the doctored provenance, as to the allegedly falsified origins of the record breaking Omega Speedmaster. The second article that I covered in the second installment, Omega uh, involved Omega's own official statement, where they came forward as the buyer in the case of this auction. And they said that they will actually go after everyone who was involved with this alleged global conspiracy, including 3 former employees of Omega. They have argued that these people not only enriched themselves in the process, but also seriously hurt Omega's reputation, and therefore they actually are in the process of taking legal measures. Omega is in the process of taking legal measures against everyone purportedly involved in the process that led to this record breaking sale of a Speedmaster that never was, of a Speedmaster that was part original, part reproduction, and was bolstered fully by a made up origin story in a in an alleged conspiracy that involved people internal to the Omega Corporation. And Omega is now coming forward as a victim in this process, allegedly. And so is Philips. And Omega basically said they have every intention to go after people who were involved in the alleged conspiracy through their legal means. And in the third installment, I covered the Neue Zürcher Zeitung interview with Sacha Davidoff, who presented a very nuanced and detailed expert perspective. In the fourth installment, in 2 days, I'll be back with an interview, live interview of someone who played a very important role in first presenting this case to the public. And I look forward to seeing you all in the audience then as well. Stay tuned. I'll be back with the late show momentarily, where we will talk about watches. And of course, that will be, as always, an open stream with a panel. So feel free to click there and follow me there. I might grab a quick drink and relax a little bit, but I will be back to talk watches momentarily. Thank you so much for your presence and support. Please hit the like button. It really matters for a channel like this. And support the platform. As you know, this is the only fully independent platform that is building a community around the pure passion and profound knowledge for wristwatches and wristwatches only, timepieces more generally, of course. And if you would like to contribute to the channel, you know how. But at any rate, if you just click the upvote button, if you just smash the like button, as they say, that will be a lot of help. If you're just stumbling upon the channel, if you have found this live stream through other means, and if you're interested in watches, please feel free to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because I'm here with watch content every day and sometimes more than once a day. So stay tuned. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.